Millennia of warfare has warped the warriors of the World Eaters, transforming them into a horrifying facsimile of their loyalist kin. In their madness, little care is given to their armour and weapons, leaving them battered, worn, and coated in gore. While many have chosen to bedeck themselves in the colour of the blood god, there are still some who bear the original markings of the Legion. Today's tutorial will focus on such warriors, presenting a guide for painting Grimdark Khorne berserkers in the Heresy-Era scheme. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Red Path. You are watching the Crimson Canvas, and in today's episode we will be painting Khorne berserkers in a realistic Grimdark style that follows the Heresy-Era white armour scheme. This isn't the first time we have covered the scheme on the Red Path, so you may be wondering what the need is for a new video. Well, over the last year I've been working on refining the method, working out ways to improve it, make it quicker, more brutal, and incorporating some new skills I've learned. Furthermore, this tutorial will be much higher quality than our previous versions, and much shorter, making it easier to digest. Before we dive in, if you find this video useful and would like to support the channel, please consider signing up to our Patreon by following the link in the description. Hobby and 8-band tier patrons will get access to a full detailed written guide for this and all future tutorials, as well as access to our hobby focused channel in the Discord, where you can chat with like-minded folks and get focused feedback from myself. You'll also get a sneak peek of upcoming projects and miniatures that we're working on for the channel. Your support really helps us out and allows me to keep making videos for everyone. So thank you to all our existing patrons, and without further ado, let's grab the brushes, get painting. So grab yourselves a brew, and let's dive in. We are going to be working on this Khorne berserker, a member of the squad that I kit bashed on the last hobby video. I started by priming the miniature in black, and once that was dry, zenithal priming it with Ashen Grey from Colourforge. This is a relatively new primer on the market and is part of Colourforge's signature series. It was developed by Lawrence from Tabletop Tactics, and when I spoke to him about it, he said it was designed to specifically work for an off-white World Eater scheme. Since I started using this primer, it's cut hours of work out of the process, and I highly recommend the product for anyone who is painting the Heresy-Era scheme. Once the primer has dried, I applied a zenithal highlight to the white armour panels using Vallejo's Dead White through the airbrush. For this, I'm using my Mobius 0.2 airbrush from Galleri, which is a fantastic tool for quick base coating and precision work. Check out our affiliate link below if you want to pick up one of these airbrushes yourself. Once that's done, I'm moving on to the shoulder pads. For this squad, I wanted to do red shoulders to symbolize that they were a higher rank than standard berserkers. If you wish to go for blue, you can simply mirror the scheme using blue paint. I've provided further details on this in the written guide for our patrons. We begin with a base coat mix of Wordbearer's Red, Rhinox Hide, a touch of black, and a touch of Mephiston Red. Once a strong coat of this is down, I gradually work more and more Mephiston Red into the mix, eventually transitioning to Evil Sun Scarlet. With each successive layer, I work in a smaller area, angling towards the point of light at the top of the shoulder pad. While I've kept the reds relatively muted in this case, if you want them to pop more, simply work in more Evil Suns to create a stronger contrast from dark to light. So it's time to move on to some sponge chipping for the armour panels. For this, I'm using a technique developed by Darren Latham. First, I tear off a piece of sponge, ensuring it is quite small. Taking an old brush protector, I push the sponge in, twisting it until only a small part remains at the top. This creates a paintbrush-like device, giving us a higher level of precision and control over our chipping effects. For the chips themselves, I'm going to use a mixture of Rhinox Hide and Abaddon Black, mixed 1-to-1. I've thinned this slightly, but less so than a normal layer. If you make it too thin, the chips will become transparent and not look very good. I wipe most of the paint off the sponge and start by dabbing it onto the armour. It's best to focus on areas where chipping would logically occur, such as the bottom of the legs, hands, and chest. The more paint you remove initially, the smaller the chips will be, leading to a more natural look. You can do as few or as many chips as you like, and vary up the size, but I prefer to keep them pretty light and not go overboard on the effect. Next, we'll block in our metallic colours. Beginning with the bronze trim areas, I put down a base coat of jet exhaust burnt iron from Ammo MIG over 2 thin layers. This provides a strong, dark brownish metal tone upon which we can build future brighter tones. For those, I've blended in Runelord brass into the base coat mixture, gradually adding more over a couple of layers and almost dry brushing it on to get a more natural look. As that builds up, I start to blend in Canoptic alloy, a really nice silvery bronze tone which acts as a strong cold highlight for the otherwise warm bronzes. The process for the irons and steel is similar. I begin with a base coat of gunmetal, applying it in 2 thin coats. I then successfully dry brush on polished metal and steel. These paints from Ammo MIG are relatively similar to those available from Citadel, but I find that the Ammo MIG tones are a little bit more realistic and much smoother in consistency, making them easier to work with. I do strongly recommend checking out their acrylic range for cheap and realistic metals. Now we'll move on to my least favourite bit of the base coating, the skulls and the leathers. Previously, I used to slowly build up fine transitions from dark to light browns, but recently I found that there's a faster way of doing this. I simply cut out some of the tones and dry brush the layers to almost no visible difference for the final product. Beginning here, I've base coated the areas in Rhinoxide over 2 layers, and following this, I'm doing loaded dry brush passes using Mournfang Brown, Scragban, XV88 and Xandri Dust. Each successive layer is applied lighter than the previous one, and for the skulls, focus more on the flat raised areas, leaving behind the darker browns in the recesses. This modification of the method is much faster to do and makes what was previously a very boring step quite efficient and easy. With the base coats laid down on the miniature, we're going to move on to some unifying washes next. For my unifying wash, I'm going to be using an oil wash. This technique is a keystone for the grimdark look and has easily been the most impactful method I've learned during my years of painting. While it can be daunting to newcomers, I assure you, it's a very simple technique and extremely fun too. Oils are quite different to acrylic paints, so to create the oil wash, I'm going to first add a little lampblack and raw umber to a metal mixing dish. It's important to use metal and not plastic, as the thinner we use to dilute this paint can corrode plastic. As you can see, I'm using very little paint to create the wash, and I'm going to add in some thinner. The thinner I use to dilute this paint is not water. Instead, it's called Sansador, which is an odorless mineral spirit produced by Windsor and Newton. Conventional white spirits can also work, or the more refined artist white spirit, but Sansador is my choice due to low toxicity and longer drying time. As a note, it is very important to protect yourself when preparing an oil wash. Use a respirator and ensure you're wearing gloves. It's also a good idea to protect your workspace with some paper towels. The more thinner you add here, the more diluted the wash will be. Usually, I like to make it about as diluted as a conventional wash from Citadel. A thicker wash will have a stronger effect, but be harder to work with. Once the wash is prepared, I apply it liberally over the entire miniature. Yes, this looks terrible right now, but that's perfectly okay. The end result is going to be much nicer. I use an old synthetic brush for this step, as oil washes can be quite damaging to natural hair brushes. You don't have to be careful during this part, simply lather the model in a nice, murky coat of paint. Oil washes normally take up to 24 to 48 hours to dry, so once it's covered, I'm going to leave the miniature on my desk for between 4 to 6 hours before I start working on it again. This will give the paint some time to cure and allow the spirits to begin to evaporate. You can speed up the process by using a hairdryer on low power, and I usually give it a quick pass just before I start working again, as it flashes off the spirits and prevents the miniature from drying glossy. So now we're ready for the reductive technique after the miniature has dried for about 4 hours. This is probably one of the most fun parts of the entire process. Taking a Q-tip, we're going to soak it lightly in those same mineral spirits we used for the oil wash, and we'll gently dab at the miniature in areas where we want to remove the oil paint. As you can see, it soaks up most of the paint and reveals the acrylic tones underneath. In this way, we have unparalleled control over where we want our wash to be and where we want to remove it. You can manipulate the paint during this step to enhance darker areas and brighten your high points. It's important to be light in your touch with the Q-tip and to not flood the area with thinner either. Moving around the model, we will slowly reveal the acrylic undertones which have also been tinted by that wash even after the removal process. After a couple of passes like this, I'm going to use an old, fine-tipped brush to add more detailed removals. Similarly dipped in thinner, the brush allows for fine manipulation of the wash in delicate or hard to reach areas, and gives you a high degree of control. At this stage, I usually let the miniature sit for about 30 minutes on my desk before coming back to it and inspecting it. Fresh eyes after a break will often spot mistakes or areas that require refinement. And following this, a quick pass with the hairdryer will flash off excess spirits and let the miniature finish curing overnight before doing any more work. So I took a picture of the miniature at this stage following the curing process, and you can see how we already have moved from very bright and poppy base coats to a moody grimdark atmosphere. I wish I could tell you that you can achieve the same level of filtering with Citadel washes, but it's simply not true. I do want to reiterate that trying oil washes is a lot of fun, and it's going to open up new doors for your skill development. So don't feel daunted by the process, just try it. But now it's time to move on to some weathering. The first thing I do for the weathering stage is to go back on any metallic areas and add what I like to call the jagged highlight. It's an uneven, somewhat randomized edge highlight of either canoptic alloy or steel in this case. It helps to reinforce those metal tones, which might have become dull during the wash process, and it also looks like fresh damage on the hard edges of the metals. It's a bit of a time-consuming process, and it might feel redundant, but it's a small effect which greatly accentuates the final product. Now we can move on to the true weathering, which most people find to be the best part of the process. For this, I'm going to be using a series of enamel paints from Ammo MIG. These function similarly to oil paints in that they interact with spirits instead of water. You can use a hairdryer to almost automatically dry these, which is very useful. Some people like to use this in place of oil washes for the unification step, and it's not a bad idea, but it is much harder to control the dilution level and you're somewhat restricted to specific color ranges. In any case, for the weathering, the paints I'm using here are Track Rust, Streaking Grime, Dark Streaking Grime, Streaking Rust, and Light Rust Wash. Applying these is very simple. Start with your darkest tone, Track Wash in this case. I move around the model and apply the paint in areas where gunk and grime would naturally build up. This is usually the extremities of limbs, in recessed areas, and around machine parts. It's particularly good to apply it as a pin wash around any lower areas of trim. And it can also be applied as streaking, where you pick an origin point and drag the brush vertically downward. Don't worry if it looks bad initially, the refinement step will clean it all up. So coming back in with a Q-tip or a brush, we now refine those enamel paints. The brush is very lightly dampened in spirits, and similar to the reductive technique, we now manipulate exactly where we want the particular effect to be. We can use it to lightly transition the effect or refine our streaking lines. In areas where we have overspilled, we can now easily clean them up. Following this, we simply repeat the process, using the various other effects that we want to apply. I'll let those steps play out here, but there are some important tips to keep in mind. First, always remember that when it comes to effects like this, less is more. If you oversaturate a miniature in grime and rust, you'll lose clarity, making it very busy and messy. If you're overly precise and uniform in your application, the effects will look unnatural. For example, not every metallic component should be rusted. Not every streak should be one specific color or length. Variation and randomization are key. But on that note, do try to have a sense of logic and realism incorporated too. Rust builds up where water collects, so don't apply it in areas where that wouldn't happen. Bronze metals don't rust at all, so instead apply a greenish grime, like dark streaking grime, to emulate oxidation. Areas that see more wear and tear will be much more corroded compared to, say, the back of this miniature or his helmet. Weathering effects are a mix of art and science. They follow a certain amount of realistic logic, but you also don't want to overwhelm the miniature. So following this, I usually let the miniature fully cure out before returning to it for blood effects. And I've developed a really fun and easy technique for this step, which creates realistic blood spatter and splash, but it does require the various enamels and oils to be absolutely dry before application. To prepare the blood mixes, I've got one of Blood for the Blood God with a touch of Rhinoxide and black, and another mix that just doesn't have any Rhinoxide put in. Both of these are thinned down with water, more so than a normal layer, but less so than a wash. Taking a Q-tip, I lightly brush thinner over the area which will receive the blood effect, and then, using an old frayed brush, apply the mixture of blood in quick, sharp streaking motions, or aggressive dabbing motions. What you'll start to see is the blood coagulate and draw together on the miniature. This is because the thin layer of thinner and the blood paint cannot mix, so the blood paint will pool into very natural looking spatters and splashes. The thinner your blood mix is, the stronger the effect will be. Alternating between the mixes, as well as straight Blood for the Blood God, will allow you to vary your tones to emulate old dried blood and fresh spilled blood. As with the weathering, though it is tempting to drown the model in gore, please restrain yourselves. And with that, the miniature is essentially done. Off camera, I've added a bluish glow for the eye lenses and touched up some areas which needed refinement. Overall, the process is relatively quick aside from the long curing times, and the actual time spent painting at the desk for this miniature was approximately 3 to 4 hours. This refined process cuts out a lot of the tedious layering work and instead focuses on the enjoyable components, such as the washing and the weathering. I've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, and while it leaves us with a miniature that certainly looks good, there are ways to refine and enhance the method for characters or models that you want to lavish some more time on. Before we close this video out, just a reminder that if you did enjoy it and you want to support us, our Patreon link is down below. You can hop into the Discord too, which is free to everyone involved. Liking, commenting and subscribing also helps us a lot and lets me know that you're enjoying the hobby videos and want to see more. I'm always willing to take tutorial suggestions, and while I do preference what our Patreons want to see, feel free to drop a comment with a tutorial request. Finally, expect to see a lot more hobby content this year. The next video is probably going to focus all on oils and the different ways you can use these paints on a miniature. Look forward to that in the coming weeks. For now though, thank you all so much for watching this episode of the Crimson Canvas. I've been Dara, this has been The Red Path, and until the next one, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.